Welcome to the last Answer the Call to Conscious Leadership event of 2021, which is really hard to grasp right now. I'm your host, Karen Huller. I am one of the co-managers of the C3 community, the Corporate Consciousness Co-op. Very much missing my partner in creation today, Lawrence Henderson, who's just busy wrapping up everything for the last month of the year. But I'm very happy and blessed to be joined today by Tony Johnson and Ira Wolfe. And we're going to talk about disrupting the status quo, which is really a very big topic. We were just talking about that. I think that we'll probably need to tackle all the different areas that need disruption today. And I look forward to kicking it off, really, I think. So Tony, I actually met Tony several years ago. She was a mentor for the Young Entrepreneurs Academy, where I am an instructor. And she is a storyteller and relationship currency negotiator. And boy, was I able to even just witness that in the last week. She has made so many powerful introductions. And I love the way she does it using the voice recording feature of LinkedIn messaging to just explain to the two parties, why they should be connecting. And it's wonderful. I'm so grateful that we reconnected and that she's here to talk about disrupting the status quo. I know that she's a PhD candidate. Tony, can you tell us a little bit about the research that you're doing right now?
Sure, Karen. Thank you. Thank you for having me. So the research is on the lived experiences of Black women entrepreneurs, and I call it the scalability continuum. Why aren't Black women entrepreneurs scaling their businesses? Because Black women entrepreneurs actually start more businesses than any other demographic. However, they do not scale. So what are the impediments for them to scale? And so I have been doing this research for about almost 3 years now. And I have some interesting findings, but I'm not quite finished yet. But we can definitely talk more about it. So, yeah.
Great. And Ira Wolfe is here. He is the Chief Googleization Officer. He's also president of Poise for the Future and founder of the Success Performance Solutions. And he's a very top-rated HR influencer and speaker. He calls himself a millennial trapped in a boomer's body. Can you explain that to us, Ira?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know there's a lot of finger pointing and deflection and stereotyping of all the different generations. And really, generations in many regards is a mindset. And I probably align myself now, maybe I should change it to Gen Z and a baby boomer body. But I definitely have a much younger mindset or an outlook than my chronological body demonstrates. So I'm definitely an older baby boomer. But I think much more aligned, and I enjoy the conversations I have with entrepreneurs, but especially a lot of the millennials and Gen Z. So.
And this is your book you're marketing behind you. Can you tell us about it?
It's Recruiting in the Age of Googleization. It really was kind of it was the next step in the series. My first book was Perfect Labor Storm, and there was a forecast almost 20 years ago what the workforce was going to look like. If we thought it would evolve, and then all of a sudden 2020 hit, and here it was. So almost nothing in 2021 surprises me. Seems to shock everybody else that all the shortages and on those darn millennials and young people just don't want to work. And what happened to everybody? And some of it's just numbers. I had a conversation with my physician this morning, and she said, I just don't understand these young people. Nobody wants to work anymore. And part of it's this work ethic, and it's not young. There's some older, there's all generations. But I started with that, and then so many people talked about the generations. And at the time, it was about Gen X, and then the millennials were just coming into the workforce. So I said, well, since everybody was interested in that, I wrote a book called Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization. And it was about the generations, but how technology influenced each of those. Our grandparents, electricity, or a television was new technology. A refrigerator that didn't need ice was a technology. So there were so many things that needed technology. So I sort of looked at it, and then I said, it needs an update. And I did my TED Talk in 2016. It was about change. And I said, I'm going to leverage that. And I'm just going to go in and we'll talk about, and realizing that even in that 7-year period, so much had changed. I was looking for where I talked about the tablet, like the iPad, and realized that it wasn't. I wrote it in 2008, and the iPad didn't come out to 2010. And then to think how all of that was transformational. I mean, how much of a disruption it had. I mean, it completely blew the laptop out of the water. And the smartphone had just been released, and think about all the disruption. I know we're going to get into that topic, the disruption that it had. And so I said, I'm just going to start from scratch and write a book. And so the first half of the book, by the way, for anybody who says, well, we're not into recruiting, I don't hire people, I don't supervise people. The first half of the book is exclusively just about change. It's like 140 pages. And then I said, let me put this into context of what people are struggling with. And we talked about hiring people. So, but even if you just read the first 140 pages, it's going to be what we're going to be talking about today. How did we get into this mess? And the big question is, people always ask, when is it going to end? When is this going to stop? And very simple answer. I'll give you the end. It's not.
Yeah. Surprise ending.
It's not. Yeah. If you don't want to know that part of the story, then don't. Please buy the book, but you may not be happy with the ending. But if you want to know how to get through that, we're going to have a rich conversation. And the good news is it takes more than me. I don't have all the answers. I have more questions than I have answers. So it's really going to take a village. And I really appreciate it, Karen, being part of this conversation. And great to meet you, Tony.
And welcome to the C3 community as well, because that's what we're all here for. Everybody in the C3 community is committed to co-creating a more conscious corporate landscape and creating that change together, because that's the idea. We're all creating ripples. If we put our ripples together, maybe we can accelerate the pace of transformation. So if you're here watching and you have a question, just pop it in. We'd love to know what you have to ask Tony and Ira, what thoughts you have on our topics. The big question, I think, is, Tony, we'll start with you. What do you see as being the biggest areas in need of disruption right now?
Talent. Ira, he was, talking about, his book, recruiting. I think talent, how we source talent. A lot. I just had a couple conversations with people. The gamut on the gamut of C-suite to frontline workers, and really talking about how we hire and corporations, the ATS, the applicant tracking system, they're still using it. And it befuddles me that we're still using a system that does not work. It befuddles me. And I think that, until organizations truly start looking at what drives people, you're not going to get the talent that you want, because, people can tell you anything on a resume. And I am not a cover letter person. I've been in HR for a long time. And if you send me a cover letter, I'm not reading it. That's why I don't require it. Any organization that says, oh, well, we want a cover letter. I said, well, you know what? You can get a dictionary and just get some big words and make yourself look good, and everything will be fine. But is that truly the person? Take the time on the front end to understand who you're looking for, and interview. Take the time, but people don't want to take the time because we live in an instantaneous society.
Well, so, I'm working on that disruption on my end, and I have for the last 15 years. So on my end, I do write my clients' cover letters, but they're not to HR, they're not to recruiters, they're direct to hiring managers, they're not templates, they're not just using big words. It's really doing the research. It's demonstrating that they have done a good enough job of understanding some of the problems that are being posed to some of the challenges, some of the initiatives that the companies are doing, and really filling in the gaps between their experience and what's going on, and positioning themselves uniquely. Like, what is it that really makes them special? So when it's done well, in my professional opinion, it's really a time saver, because it can hit all the boxes. Not just what your qualifications are, but really, why is this the culture fit? Why are your experiences compatible with what's going on in the company and what's going to go on in the company? So they can be done well, and they can be effective. But I always advise them not to send them to HR. I was a recruiter, and they always start the same. Like there's no hook. It's like, I'm interested in this position. So.
But you have to think. So, Karen, I want you to just think about this. I'm not saying there's no right or wrong.
Yeah.
As a hiring manager, where is that hiring manager on emotional intelligence, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of people who hire people don't have emotional intelligence. That's what
need for disruption too, right?
Exactly.
Let's get some leadership EQ in there.
That's a shock.
Get all leaders EQ coaching, because it is something that can be developed, and it's actually I've done a lot of research on EQ, and actually you don't develop that part of your brain fully until the third decade of your life. So it can be accelerated, the development of it. It can be also cut short. Trauma is something that can totally cut short someone's development of their emotional intelligence. We're hitting so many different areas of disruption. Ira, I want you to be able to jump in here from your perspective. If you agree with Tony, or if there's another area of disruption that you see is a need. You talked about work ethic. Tell us how that could be disrupted.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, there's a couple of things I'm going to challenge Tony on, but I'm going to come back. When we talk about disruption, and this comes from a good friend of mine who wrote a book on it called The Disruption Mindset, Charlene Lee. I'd highly recommend, if you're not familiar with her, pick up the book, listen to the book. But she talks, and I agree with her. She says that the word disruption is overblown, it's exaggerated, it's hyperbole. We don't always need to disrupt. And what brought that to mind, Tony, is when you said about the ATS. The ATS, there's a problem with the ATS. There's no question. But the problem isn't the ATS. The problem is the employment of the ATS. So it's the old, and a couple of my students in my organizational change class that I was teaching the other night said, "Oh, that's brand new. Never heard of that before." It's GIBO, GIBO, garbage in, garbage out. The fact is, the ATS was designed for the employer to automate job posting and to initially screen out people. That's what it was designed to do. But it was built from the employer perspective. It was also designed 15, 20 years ago. It's advanced. Now you can post to social media and you can do a couple other things. But if you're still copying, pasting a job description, that's not a story you should appreciate. I mean, that's a horrible story that you're telling about why do you want to work for my company? Here's the job description. And the filters that are put on there are all gamed. I mean, a good candidate hires people to write the resume. They know how to play the keywords. It really doesn't screen quality. It screens how good somebody was at playing the game. And but the ATS is absolutely needed, because because there's too many people that I hear is go, well, we need to go back to the people side of this. Well, there's no way that there's enough time, money, and resources to hire enough people to screen all the applicants, all the applications. And so we need technology to help us get to the quality candidates, the people that are qualified. The problem is HR and in a broader sense, companies, hiring managers don't know what a good candidate looks like. When you ask them, you get a laundry list. Oh, we need people who work hard, have a good work ethic, they're a team player, they're a collaborator, they need a 4-year degree, they need 3 years of experience. And the question is how do you know and why? And so part of it is the ATS, if it had the right information, it's still a clunky system. There's no question about it. It needs to be improved. It needs to be written, redesigned, reconstructed, considering the candidates as well. Mm-hmm. How do we create a better experience for that? That's the whole part of my book. But the other part is the employers, companies need technology. I mean, they can't do it on their own. And it needs to be used to free up time so that the recruiter, HR, hiring manager can spend more time with the right people. The problem is it's the right information is not going in there because most companies don't have it. And that's what I deal with every day. I mean, my core business is pre-employment and leadership testing. and I'll say, at the end of the year, what do you want that person to accomplish? How are you going to measure their success? And I can tell you that 90% of the people don't know. Well, we want them to show up. Okay, so if they show up 365 days a year, is that good enough? Well, no. We need we need to be a good team player. Why? How much? What does that do? Do they really need to be a team player? Do they just need to contribute? Do they need just to go? What does a team player mean? Are you going to accept their views as an open environment? Do they contribute, or do you just want them to show up and follow your lead? Is that what you mean? But they don't know, and so how does a recruiter on behalf of a hiring manager screen for how do they identify the right people that are out there? How do they identify the right talent? So long way around there. We can spend all day on what's wrong with recruitment, but it absolutely it does need to be disruptive. But disruption's not buying the next piece of technology. Disruption is changing the way you access talent, and it's not talent acquisition, it's talent access. How do you access the right talent? And many times the right talent's sitting right in front of you. You're already on your payroll, and companies do a horrible job of recognizing and taking care, which is retention, engagement, experience, their existing people. So that's another part of disruption that you have. So I'll let somebody else speak, but I can go on all day. Obviously I'm pretty passionate and opinionated about it.
Definitely. I mean, I'd have to agree that most hiring managers need help gaining clarity on exactly what's going to make somebody successful under their lead and in the company, and what's going to fit, and certainly where to find the talent. And as far as the applicant tracking system goes, I mean, there's definitely not one. There's definitely like 250 different applicant tracking systems with very different requirements and compatibilities. That make it hard for somebody like me who brands people and writes the resumes to accommodate them, but in a way that also enables them to stand out and be unique. There's so many. I was teaching creatives at Cabrini University who wanted to stand out and be unique, and I'd have to be like, well, you can use this resume. I was just like, use this Word document to write your great resume, and then alter it with whatever graphic embellishments you want to put out there, because that's what they're displaying. It was very challenging. And as in terms of disruption, I mean, and it doesn't mean reinvention completely all the time. It just means this is broken. We need to find out what the source problem is and fix it. Sometimes we need to tear it all down and build it back up, but oftentimes it means this is working. Let's keep this part of it. This is broken. Just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean it's the best way possible. And where are we really being stifled in innovating? And why are we being stifled in innovating? I definitely want to talk about all the challenges to disruption that we face and how leaders can overcome it. Tony, maybe you can jump in there. Like what do you see as being the big challenges to disrupting in terms of talent?
So for me, from my experience, what I've noticed for talent, so I'm heavily researched in the area of psychometrics and really understanding what drives people and how can you be successful in your employment. And I think that if you truly want to get talent, like Ira said, yeah, the ATS system for me, it is a system, right? And like you said, garbage in, garbage out. However, there's so much garbage, and we hold on to this thing is that we need this. I'm not saying that we don't, but we definitely have to fix it, because if we keep doing the same thing over and over again. And so to disrupt, you need to start looking at different aspects of, like you said, what does a team player look like in this particular position? One of the last organizations I was working with, we put in a system to really understand, like the applicant can literally take this, test. And, it's not so much a test. It's just like, talk about the things that drive you. And because what I found is that when you talk to people, and you have that time and they have time to really say, oh, this is not a rushed thing to fill out this application. And yeah, it may take me 10 minutes to fill it out, 10, 15 minutes. I think 10, 15 minutes is a long time, but hey, that's just me. But that should be, and be able to like give them the chance to really think about it, go away and come back and really think about, tell them, say, listen, we want you to be thoughtful. Whatever happened to messages? I always make my clients put a message in their ATS system. Got to put a message. You got to connect with the people.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, listen, we want you to be thoughtful. And this is what we are. Because whatever your mission, whatever your culture is, put that there. Don't just put words. Show them your face. Because what happens is people identify with what they're comfortable with, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is where we're lacking in trying to get talent. We're saying, oh, yeah, we have all these awards. So what? I don't care if you have awards. It doesn't benefit me. Well, how does it benefit me?
Right.
And so hopefully that answered your question.
Well, I think we definitely tipped the iceberg. I mean, what do you think the causes of resistance are around abandoning the applicant tracking system altogether? If it's
So
not
for
working.
me, to be honest, so let me tell you this.
Yeah.
When I came into HR, the woman who hired me was a friend of my mom's. Very nice woman. And what I saw in HR, this is many years ago, I saw that white women that were in HR positions were holding on to a death grip, right? They were holding on to a death, even now. And I can say this because if you look at the makeup of companies and women who keep HR positions in the city of Philadelphia,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about anywhere else, all their chief people officers, they're particularly white women.
Mm-hmm.
And these women hold on to the death grip and they're like, no, well, even though I go to, a symposium, I'm part of this organization, I'm a part of that one. Yeah, but I think this is still the best, most efficient way because this is how we used to do it. I always tell people the HR people are the worst people. They cannot deal with change. They hate change. And that's how we need to disrupt the system.
Well, and that just tees it up for one of my catchphrases is that as humans, and this is documented by research. There's a great article in HBR, Harvard Business Review, that was just released, and it talks about how our brains were not wired for the amount of uncertainty that we have.
Yep.
Humans are addicted to certainty. That's why they're so stuck on that status quo. This is the world we live in. I'm dealing, and again, going back to the millennials and the baby boomers and whatever age you're chronological, how old you are or young you are, or what your socioeconomic status was. That's your frame of reference. That's your bubble. We all sort of live in bubbles. And many of us try to get outside that, but it's tough to walk in the shoes of other people that you have no idea unless you sit down with them. So I'm sitting with a group of master's levels students in a leadership program. We're talking about organizational change. And I highly recommend this series to everybody, but it was a PBS series. It was out in the summer. You now can get it on Amazon Prime and somewhere, maybe iTunes. It's called The Future of Work. And it was a 3-hour series, 3 1-hour sessions. It opened my eyes to a lot of things. But surprisingly, I said, I'm going to make this part of this course. I'm going to have them watch it. And what shocked me was the 25 and 30-year-olds I have no idea how fast the world is changing. I have no idea how my industry is changing. I have no idea how other people's lives are changing. And they're supposed to be these digital natives that are used to this. So, part of it is that, as humans, we're addicted to certainty. And then even when we say, no, we're open-minded, is you might be open-minded, but literally you have to you have to work on it. Again, I'm going to quote her again, is Charlene Lee. She says, innovation's easy, disruption is hard. And I think that's so telling, because you can come up with a great idea, but disrupting your business, disrupting HR, disrupting even something that sounds simple to all three of us, of changing the way that you recruit. If it's not working, don't keep doing it. I mean, that's the old definition of insanity. We'll just try harder, and that's sort of that mindset. And part of the blame, and hopefully we can get into this. We talk about adaptability and AQ on the assessment side. I mean, we've been working with adaptability quotient, and not so much that it's, oh, this is the end all and be all, but it gives a framework. But so much emphasis over the last 2 years or before, thanks to Angela Duckworth, has been to grit. And grit is perseverance and passion, and we all need it. We certainly need to persevere and endure and get through stuff, and we need resilience because we're going to be knocked down over and over again. Again, Omicron and virus variant. There's so many things that are going to hit us that we're going to have to keep going ahead, but we're going to get knocked down. We got to get up. The problem with both of those is that the correlations in this, there is data that show this. The more grit and the more resilience you have, the lower your ability to unlearn bad behaviors is. So there's a correlation between changing your behavior. What we do is we pile it on. We say what we need is grit. Oh, well, we did grit last year. Let's learn to be more resilient. Oh, let's learn about being more open-minded. Let's be a better team player. And we sort of we're building this Jenga tower of learning, and eventually it gets tough to balance, and it gets to be a high, weak stack. We need to say some of the stuff we learned, and as an older baby boomer, there's a whole lot that I learned that turned out to be not true, or it was true at the time and now it's no longer true because things changed. We need to unlearn a lot. We need to learn, but we need to unlearn, make room in our heads and our behaviors for some of the things that aren't working. And that's a new concept, because before it was like you just accumulate all this knowledge over time. And now it's like, some of the knowledge was interesting, but just like our basements and our drawers and our closets and our attics, it gets cluttered with a lot of stuff that we think would be useful, but it gets in the way. And we need to get rid of some of that stuff. And so a lot of my focus has been on not only how do we open up minds, but how do we help people learn to unlearn, and that changes things. I mean, as soon as sometimes that concept is like, yeah, why was I hanging on to that? And so that's sort of the path to get there. But you're absolutely. But as humans, we're hardwired, and especially over the last millennial, but especially over the last few years, we're addicted to certainty. We like predictability. We want to know what's going to happen. Darn it, why can't they fix that? When is this in a pandemic going to end? And the pandemic will end, but the endemic will continue. We're going to be vulnerable, and if it's not COVID, it'll be something else, or terrorism, or social unrest, or there's so much going on in the world that we're all going to be susceptible. We're all vulnerable, and we don't like that.
Tony, I know that adaptability is part of your wheelhouse. Tell us from your perspective, how do we help people be more adaptable to navigate the inevitable changes that we're going to see and that we are seeing?
That's a tough one. I think what happens is, like Ira said, change is small increments over time, right? That's how we change, small increments over time. And so if you're asking someone to adapt to something that they're not used to, you've really touched the foundation of who they are. You've shaken everything in their lives. And you got to think about that. Like, I'm asking you, Karen, I'm like, okay, throw out everything you've known. And you're like, no, I'm not going to throw out everything. Okay, you may not throw out everything. But what I'm asking you to do is be open. And being open is being, my colleague Brene Brown, always talks about vulnerability. Well, what does that vulnerability look like for you? Because in order to adapt, you have to be vulnerable to something, to that adaptation. And I think that it's really important that we really, have organizations that are willing, so my degree is in organizational development, right? And so when we're talking about changing the whole entire organization, but you can't change an organization if you don't change the people. if they're not going to adapt. So you have to be able, I always tell people, first of all, I lead by example, right? And I say, listen, I don't have all the answers, but this is where we're going. This is how I see it. And bring people to the table. People are more apt to adapt to something if they're at the table.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that answers your question.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Ira, you're on mute. Go ahead.
Yeah, oh, sorry, Tony. We just met minutes ago, but you it's like within that minute response, there was like a million things you said that go. We need to talk a whole lot of stuff. So when I talked about working through adaptability, the name of my keynote in my webinar is "There's no app to adapt." And because people want to click the button because that's what we're used to. It's like, where do I get the answer? I'm going to Google it. How do I adapt? And there is no app to adapt. Adaptability just doesn't happen. But beyond that, this group that I'm working with and a lot of the research has created a framework. And again, not the final answer. It's evolving and changing because it's complex. But we talked about grit and resilience and unlearning. The other part of that, which I'm so appreciative you brought up about vulnerability, because it's so hard because it's a paradox. And it's a contradiction because we're told to be confident, to be strong.
True.
And then we're told to be vulnerable and transparent and authentic. And so we go into an interview or being the interviewer, going back to something as simple as that. If you came in as a candidate and shared your vulnerability, you shared what you're not good at, you shared, you were really, really authentic, you were fully transparent. My bet is you wouldn't be hired by 3/4 of the hiring managers because they can't recognize that. They want you to be strong and confident. So one of the other elements is there's five personal abilities that they identified. Grit, resilience, and unlearning were 3 of them. The other one's mental flexibility or dealing with cognitive dissonance. But it's that, how do we make sense? How do you make sense of being strong and confident, but at the same time vulnerable and transparent? And there's a whole long list of things that you can go through that we've got to help people understand those contradictions. And the fifth one, by the way, happens to be growth mindset. So it's that, hey, the more degrees you have, the more experience you have, doesn't necessarily make you better. As I want to know how you evolved, how you changed, what you're willing to do. Do you give yourself permission to try new things and fail? And again, that's that open-mindedness of people. I lived that. I mean, I have a professional, I have a health. My first career, by the way, I was a dentist. So I don't know if either of you knew that, but
I do. I saw it.
So I went through that, but it was like, wow, how did he make that?
You can.
Well, I didn't change. Yeah, I still have the same mindset I did, except for one thing. I learned at some point that the more degrees I had, I started to not take opportunities or turn down opportunities because it might make me look bad. What if I try something and I'm not good? People will doubt me. What if I ask a question? Even in class, what if I ask this question? What if I ask a question as the professor? I'm an adjunct. What if I ask a question? At one point, I won't say it's today, but at one point they were looking at, well, don't you have all the answers? And that was how we rewarded and recognized people. Fortunately, that's changing a bit, not fast enough, and it's not as widespread enough. But those are the 5 elements. So when it's not going to be easy, but when you go back to say, how do we help people adapt? How do we create that app to adapt? The reality is it's grit, resilience, and people have 1 or 2 of those. I mean, people have that or think they do. But it's how do we help them deal with all these contradictions, and how do we help them be okay making mistakes and learning from those? And which the flip side of that is organizations aren't there. I mean, you can hire all the right people and they are adaptable, but if they don't, we measure company support. Do they have your back? Do the employees feel that you have their back? Do the people you work with and your team have your back? But we also measure what we call emotional health, which is just another word for psychological safety. do people feel safe saying, "Hey, I'm burnt out. I'm stressed out"? There's a lot of burnout and stress in the workplace right now. It's, the numbers are astonishing. And how do we help people become comfortable saying, "I need help"? And does your company create that environment? So it's not just pointing, deflecting, which is what companies like to do, in managers. Like, how do we fix these people?
Wow.
Sometimes you got to look in the mirror and go, what if we had the right people? And we just did a team report, and frankly, the people were pretty good, but their opinion of the support they get and the psychological safety and the stress, we measure the work stress, was off the charts. And it's like, this isn't a problem. You don't have the right people. You have a terrible culture, or you may have a great culture. It's just being messaged and implemented horribly. But that was the conversation changed around. They don't want to hear it, but it changed around. So it's complicated. There's no question about it, but we have to do it because we can. I'm not even sure, Karen, if you did it monthly, whether we'd cover all the disruptive events and all the things that need changed in a year. So.
No, for sure. I think we could spend endless amounts of time on the things that need disruption and the potential for solutions and the challenges and all of that. And I think that we've definitely covered psychological safety in C3. We had a whole hour dedicated to it, and you also brought another thing that comes up in every single Answer the Call to Conscious Leadership event is leadership accountability and self-awareness. When you are a leader with high emotional intelligence, then you are much, even if your ego steps in for a second and wants to deflect or defend or defer to someone else, when you have high emotional intelligence, you can shift into that mindset where you can be accountable. If my team isn't happy, if my team is overwhelmed, if they're burnout, if they're not happy, then that's you. And that's why one of the things I can see being a potential solution for disruption is emotional intelligence training for all leaders, right? Would that solve, how many problems do you think that would solve?
I believe it would solve a lot, but even Daniel Goleman, kind of the father of emotional intelligence, recognizes that there's different competencies within the social and EI intelligence community. And one of those competencies is adaptability. So, which obviously resonates with me. But the reality is you could have high emotional intelligence and you're really good really reading people. You understand you understand how you respond. You can help others through it. But it doesn't necessarily make them good at change. You can comfort people through that, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're good. So in fact, one of his quotes I have in one of my presentations is that the number one predictor of career satisfaction, life success, is the adaptability competence. So if disruption, if change is part of the organization, if that's part of your responsibility, you could have a high EQ or an EI, whichever term you want to use, but it doesn't necessarily mean you still may be addicted to certainty. You may be empathetic and sympathetic and understand and can walk in everybody's shoes, how hard it is to change, but it doesn't mean you're any better at it than them. And
even neuroscientifically, the part of our brain that resists change, it's survival. It's a survival instinct. We have evolved past just having survival instincts, and we have higher, thinking and analyzing parts of our brain. We just have to, in my opinion, get greater access to that.
That's part of the conundrum, though. That's a conundrum, though, because if you talk, how are we going to survive if we cling to the status quo? So the fact is that we want this certainty and we want the status quo, and our brains are wired to survive. But the reality is running from it or hovering in the corner or resisting it is not going to help us survive.
It's not, but I think it's important to acknowledge that that's our natural reaction.
Oh, absolutely.
And when we know that that's our natural reaction, and we also know that we can use our higher learning and access our higher learning parts of our brain to overcome it, that's when we can gain some power over what's automatic Tony, I know you had some things you want to say. I want to give you a chance to jump in here.
Sure. When Ira talked about Amy's work, everybody likes to talk about psychological safety, and I really enjoy her work, but we forget about the psychological contract. Dr. Russo out of University of Pittsburgh, she's been doing for the past 30 years. Really, I've had multiple conversations with her about the psychological contract. Psychological contract is that mental contract that we have with employers, right? And a lot of people don't realize that contract. So I tell my clients, I'm like, just imagine you're walking around with all these contracts every day. Every day you're walking around with these contracts. Have you broken a psychological contract? The contract is so delicate that it can change minute to minute for a person. I could come to work happy go lucky today, and then my manager tell me, well, I need you to go do this. And the contract, well, that's not my expectation, because the contract is actually the expectations of a person, from employer to employee and employee to employer. And that can change multiple times throughout the day, because now I've done this job and I have to move to the next job, and they're saying, hey Tony, great job, we really appreciate you. And now my contract is like, well, that's what I expected. Okay, I like that. You got to talk about these things in the beginning of employment, especially from the recruitment aspect. What are some of your expectations for this job? Don't wait till you get to the interview part. I have to say to all my recruiter friends, a lot of recruiters do ask that, but they don't ask it with heart. They ask it because it's on a piece of paper. They really don't understand what it truly means, because that contract and what that person expects. If you let somebody really let their hair down, like my hair is really let down. If you let somebody really let their hair down, say, this is what I expect. I don't expect my manager. Yeah, he's going to have some good and bad days. Think about it. When you're in C-suite, I think some of the, questions like, okay, now that we're working together in C-suite, I always ask this question: how are we going to deal when we disagree? That's one of the first questions I ask people. If you're managing me or we're working together, how are we going to deal with a disagreement, or, just being upset, because people get upset. So those are the things that we really need to think about. If we look at it as a contract, am I breaking this contract? And it becomes more permanent. And I think that really educating people about these contracts is really, truly important.
Tony, can I ask you a question? Go back to how you started with where your research is.
Sure.
Where, Black women entrepreneurs. What keeps is there something you found that keeps them stuck on the status quo? Is it the lack of definition of the contract? I mean, it may be all of these. So, so you sort of brought that up, and just wondering how much that has to do with their not seizing the scope or seizing the opportunity like other, or being able to scale up, as you said.
So I have to be honest. I am part of the cohort that I am researching, and the impetus from, I really have to tell you the impetus for my study was that I had a successful restaurant here in Philadelphia. I've had actually three restaurants in two different countries. And so it was really successful. And there was a particular bank that I applied for a loan. And when I applied, well, what happens is I did their Christmas party. Catered their Christmas party, and we had a really good relationship. And when I said, man, I really want to expand my business and get a second location, he said, oh yeah, come see me at the bank. And so when I went to the bank, this at the time I did not have, I had dropped out of college. So I didn't even have my associate's degree at the time, but I had my books together. And so I go there, and the first thing the man asked me, he said, and this is in 2003, he said, what's your degree? I said, I have none. He said, well, I can't give you any money. And I said, what? Okay, so strike one. And then I realized, just talking to and being in HR, because the reason why I really went into HR is because I couldn't get a job. The jobs that I couldn't get, I wanted to understand why the HR people weren't hiring me. So I said, you know what? Let me go into HR. And so I went in HR. So when I can't figure out things, I go and do it. And so like I try to figure out like what is that? What is what is impeding me from, reaching my goal? And so in my research, what I have found is that even in corporate America, the contract is broken for Black women. We're first of all, as a woman, right? We're paid less than men. That's a fact. Okay. Then Black women are paid less than white women. Boom. There's so many things. And so now, okay, I'm going to go into entrepreneurship. All right. I don't have I'm not saying, certain women are wealthier than anyone else, but Black women traditionally, the research says that Black women don't have that generational wealth as opposed to their counterparts. And because they don't have that generational wealth, so you can't say, hey, mom, I need $50,000 or take out a second mortgage on a house. I want to start my business. They don't have that. And so they don't even have the network to be able to access the money. And so if they can't access the money, and I think that what research is saying out here is that, oh, Black women, they need skills. No, we don't need skills. I can show you my books. I'm really good in my books. I just need the access to capital. I need the opportunity to be in rooms where somebody can hear my idea. And that's why I call relationship currency. It's that relationship currency. It's that social capital. That's where Black women are, there's a deficiency for Black women in the social capital aspect. So hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And my mind's racing with a million other ideas, but so that's another show you can have, Karen.
Exactly.
we'll go down that road. So.
Yeah, absolutely. We just so you know, all of the new topics that come out of these events go into a list that goes into polls, and all of the topics are chosen by the C3 community. So any new topics that come in are going to go up there. And in 2022, we're looking at having multiple events per month and other people stepping up and co-creating and co-hosting these events so we can cover more topics, because it really is an endless amount of topics that we can cover around conscious leadership, so we can start to accelerate the momentum that we know, especially now, is so necessary. Let me talk about 2020, because Ira, you talked about your book and some foresight that you had 20 years ago about how things would be, and then you talked about 2020 and everything blowing up. How much of your foresight is true today, or how much of it has shifted simply because of 2020 and everything that happened then?
It's a great question, and it's certainly my opinion. Others may differ.
You're here to share that.
In my view, 2020 just ripped off all the Band-Aids that we put on everything and exposed how we kicked the can down the road. I certainly didn't predict the pandemic, although Bill Gates did and a lot of other people. We knew there was something that was going to happen, whether it was another terrorist attack, whether there was an economic collapse, whether there was going to be whatever it was, crazy elections. There was a million things. And it just seems that 2020, it was the convergence of every different dimension, whether it was social injustice, whether it was gender equity, whether it was the economy, whether it was poverty, whether it was climate change. It almost was everybody was home, and all of a sudden it was like, we got time to reflect. And, the world sort of sucks. I mean, the way things have been going, and we're not going to take it anymore. We're just not going to go back. So there's a lot of things that we forecast that, didn't necessarily exactly come true, but workforce shortages, demographics, technology, the acceleration of change. The acceleration of change was happening anyway. I mean, it wasn't that Zoom popped up overnight. It was very interesting. I've done a blog or a podcast. Actually, I had a radio show 20 years ago. I did it for 6 months. Perfect timing. My first two, perfect timing. First one started 2 weeks before 9/11.
Wow.
And I won't even go into all the mechanics, but I used to call into the station in Rhode Island like at 7:00 on a Friday morning. And 2 weeks later, they send me a cassette tape that I had to duplicate to send out so somebody can listen to it. But in 2010, I did one, and I just found this by accident. I was doing a search, and I interviewed somebody who talked about the next generation of video conferencing, and he literally had the next Zoom. And I contacted him again, and this is maybe 2 years ago, and said, hey, by the way, I just found this. Are you still in the business? What happened? I looked him up on LinkedIn, and he said it was the right idea at the wrong time. We just weren't there. We didn't have bandwidth. Business wasn't there. So when everybody jumped all over Zoom and said, oh, this is the greatest thing, the fact is people were talking about it 10, 15 years ago. But people, before the, I think this was like the end of 2019 or early 2020, there was a survey that was out. I can't remember how many executives, but it was a fairly large number. And 2% of all the senior executives that were surveyed said that remote work is a possibility in their company. 98% said it would never work in my business or industry. And then March rolls around, and then they redid the survey, and 50 to 80% said some form of remote work will work for us, and 20% said exclusively. So we're going to go all remote. So even at that point, it was a 1,000% increase in the number of people just overnight. So the reality was all this was in place. The one question I've asked a lot of people, and I know we've all had Zoom fatigue. Here we are on StreamYard. We're doing our Hollywood Square thing, and we're doing this two-dimensional. But go back 2010. Go back to 10 years. And imagine what the pandemic response would have been then, because we didn't have any of this technology. We didn't have Zoom. Think about how many people wouldn't have gone to work or would have gone to work and be hospitalized and gotten sick because they didn't have a choice. The fact of the matter is we still employed this. 30 million people were out of work. 110 million people were still going to work in some way. And that was only possible because half of those people were working from home. And without technology, we couldn't have done it. So the technology saved us. Did we predict that was going to happen overnight like that? We talk about it on an exponential curve, that it's going to happen just like that. But nobody thought it was going to happen on March 13th, 2020, that everybody was sent home. So that was different. But the rate of change, the acceleration, the health, the Band-Aids got ripped off, or the curtain got pulled back on how fragile the healthcare system was. It got ripped off on how fragile the education system was, how our infrastructure was, how our politics was. So I think the rapidness, how quickly it happened, shocked everybody, but it's only because it was gradual change, and the parallels like climate change. We keep saying it's not going to happen. It's the water level's only going to go up an inch every 2 years. Yeah, okay. Well, this is 9 years ago today with Sandy.
Wow.
With Hurricane Sandy.
Wow.
And it's like, wow, that was a once in a century event. And
right.
It's like, no, it's sort of like a once in a month event somewhere.
Right.
And if it's not that, it's wildfires or, Houston, I don't know how many events they've had, over the, yeah, it's going to be pretty common, and we're going to have problems, and we're going to kick it down the road. So we kicked it down the road, and 2020 exposed it.
Tony, question to you. And I don't know if this will be our last question, depends, I guess, on time, but how do we leverage the ripping off of the Band-Aid that 2020 forced us into and make sure that we use this as an opportunity and not settle back into the old normal that wasn't working for most people anyway?
Good question. However, if we look at the psychology of people, man, the psychology of people is saying that we must go back. I have to say this, I remember growing up and Leave It to Beaver was on. And when Leave It to Beaver was on, I would sit and I was like, Mom, I really want to be like this white family. And for me, 2020 was a year of exhaustion. It was a year Black people were just exhausted. I don't care where you're at in we were just
White people,
exhausted.
some white people too.
Some white people, yes, 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 yes. I think I think everybody was exhausted because of
For different
so much
reasons.
was
Yeah.
happening. But I think for when you said take back the, opening the veil of racism and social injustice, all of those things, and these are the things that, especially from a Black woman's perspective, that I've had to fight and work extra hard just to get my foot in the door. I'm talking about entry level, knowing that I have the qualifications to be in C-suite or wherever that may be. But I think that if we are truly, truly going to, not go backwards, but sometimes, let me tell you this, I always tell people, life is like a bow and arrow, called the bow and arrow effect. Sometimes we have to pull back to propel forward. And so 2020 was a year of pulling back. We pulled back. And now you have to make conscious decisions if you really you have to think about, leaders really have to think about, okay, I was raised in this, and I think a lot of leaders don't realize that their childhood has a lot to do with how they lead people. I think a lot of people don't realize that. That is really big.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's foundational. So your foundation, which you're bringing to the table. And so if you realize okay, this is foundational. However, what I've seen in 2020, hey, like Ira said earlier, it may not be true. I can adapt. So leaders really have to think about, I saw what happened in 2020. I know where I'm coming from, but am I going to continue? Am I going to go back? But if you go back, hopefully you'll propel forward. So hopefully that answers your question about it.
I hope so.
And Tony, I mean, just real quick comment. One of the things last year, it did allow me to reflect, and obviously there were a lot of events that forced people to reflect if you cared about them. But I was around, I remember the late 60s. And, I remember seeing Martin Luther King. I remember the riots in Philly and New York and Detroit and, and the marches on Washington. I remember those events. Certainly my perspective has changed. I grew up in an all white community in the coal regions. So there was obviously a bias there. But there was also an assumption that we had a lot of progress. And it all went away. And it's like, oh yeah, it's a lot better. Everybody recognizes that it's so much better. And then you realize that no, it wasn't. We just weren't paying attention. We sort of blocked it out. And that to me was the awakening. I mean, there's so many moments, we don't have enough time to go into them. But that for me, and it's like, how do we make that happen to tens of millions of other people?
There was I don't know if either of you were able to rewatch the lunchtime panel we had at ConCon. We had a couple speakers come, and one of them was Michael Taylor of Shelling Point, and Shelling Point is a data-driven and behavioral. You know them, Tony?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, right, because of and Gemo,
mm-hmm.
Right? The Future of Work Philadelphia. Yeah. So what he was talking about is one of the major barriers of change is just that a lot of people don't agree that there's a problem. Yeah. And so I guess, when something like 2020 happens and more people become aware that we haven't made as much progress as we would have liked to have thought, then that's the momentum that really was the impetus of C3. Now that we know, now that it's visible, now that we can see more of the problems and we can all agree that we haven't made as much progress as we thought and we need to start making progress now, let's see if we can co-create. And so I thank everybody who watched. Dee was here and I saw her leave, so unfortunately I didn't get to give her a little shout out, but I hope she watches the replay at the end. And I want to thank Tony for spending your time with us today. I want to thank Ira. I've loved this conversation. I can't wait to share it and have more of them, because we really just scratched the surface, and I'd love to talk for another hour or two, really. But I hope, Tony, that you and Ira connect, because I do feel like if we can, as you were saying, Tony, get everybody a seat at the table and really figure out, what are these gaps? What are the entry points? What is our resistance really all about? Then inevitably our awareness of what's really impacting people and stopping people will be there, and then we can solution our way forward, hopefully.
And I always like to, I have to interject this. I want people to understand that my perspectives are from a Black woman's perspective. And I have my partner is a white man. And he says to me, Tony, I really, he said, honestly, he said, the pandemic right now, he said, white people are exhausted from hearing about social justice. And I thought that was very interesting. And I said, wow, that's very interesting. So something just to think about, something to think about.
I can see that's true. I can see that that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would, as a white male, I would basically say that I'm not sure I'm exhausted of hearing about it, but it's frustrating, and it's still frustrating. And again, going back to a perspective of for 50 years, I've been seeing supposedly the progress, and that's behind us, and it's frustrating to know that it wasn't. So I'm not sure. I would say, from my perspective, it's more frustrating, and I know there's a lot of other people like that.
Thank you.
Like everything else, we're divided.
Yes, yeah, and I mean you can see in the commentary that there's a general climate of come on, can't we,
let's get over. Come on, move on.
Let's go back to normal.
Right.
But thank you for having me,
that.
Karen.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Ira.
guys. All right.
Bye.
See everybody next year.
Have a great holiday.
Yeah, you too.